All right, sand dunes. So sand dunes are going to pop up in our marine environments as well, but we're just talking about interior sand dunes. We're talking about the Sahara Desert, the dunes of Death Valley, things like that. So again, obviously they're found in dry climates, and it's wind. Wind is the agent of transport here. Okay, so we've talked about agents of transport like water, glaciers. We've talked about wind already, but think about it like this. Wind, like I said before, wind can't pick up large pieces of rock. It's just too weak unless you're dealing with something like tornadic or tornado winds, and those are rare. Steady winds that you're dealing with just in your everyday life can only pick up things like sand grains and really fine particles, and they pick up previously eroded material and carry it away. And so when you find dunes, they actually tend to shift around. Winds can shift, winds can move. So frequently you'll hear the shifting dunes is a common phrase, and it's not a joke. Those things tend to move. There's some evidence that there are ancient civilization deposits buried in the Sahara that can pop up at will just because the dunes have shifted. So if you see sand dunes, you're dealing with wind as your erosional agent. And if you find a rock that you know is like 2 billion years old and all it's made of is fine-grained sand, so if it's sandstone, then you might reason that you might be dealing with a previously sandy environment like a sand dune or a beach, as we'll get to in a minute. And they can stretch for hundreds of kilometers. Like I said, in the Sahara Desert's a great example. But they can also be smaller. You know, if you've gone to the dunes in Death Valley, they're not huge, but they're certainly fun. Excuse me. So a meandering river is a little different. Okay, so meandering rivers tend to be flowing along flat ground, and their giveaway is that S curve, that sort of really sharp, windy curve they have as they go around and around. And that's because they're just not, you know, they're not on a steep environment. So they tend to move more slowly, and they actually cut through the ground a lot more slowly as well. Because they're flowing slowly, they have less energy, so they can't really carve out canyons or these steep canyons. You need faster moving water, and to have faster moving water, you need a steep gradient. So meandering rivers are almost always typically indicative of their age. Meandering rivers are older, okay? And the reason that we know they're older is essentially our reasoning can be that mountains are relatively young compared to a lot of the older rock around them. So like mountains grow, right? So the Appalachians are a little older. So the Appalachians have lost a lot of their gradient, which means that a lot of the water that comes out of the Appalachian Mountains, which are old and eroded, a lot of that water is flowing over less steep ground because the rocks, the Appalachian Mountains aren't steep anymore. However, the streams and rivers coming out of the Rocky Mountains or out of the Sierras, those are still pretty steep because they're still coming out of relatively young, steeper mountains. So the meandering rivers are typically older. And one other feature that they can have, and I'll jump around for a second because I just really like to talk about oxbow lakes, is they can have oxbow lakes. Okay, so if you look at this picture right here, there's this area in the image that I want to highlight. It's the central part right here. So one way of knowing if you're dealing with a meandering river and to know if it's older is older meandering rivers will have lots of oxbow lakes immediately off to the side. And what happens is over time, the water that's flowing here carves out the edge of this rock, and the water that's flowing here carves it out, and eventually these parts meet, okay? And this whole section closes off. It's now cut off from the main part of your river, and your meandering river is now free to just flow that way. Okay, so this section's been cut off as your lake. That's your oxbow lake. And the meandering river, again, remember guys, nature's lazy. It's going to take the easier path. Now it can just flow straight through this area that connected. So the more oxbow lakes you have, the older your river is because essentially the more time it's had to form those lakes. The flatter area around it is heavily subject to flooding. It's called your floodplain. The soil around your floodplain is usually mud and river sediments because it's usually formed from the periodical overflow of this river. I grew up in somewhere called the Ohio River Valley. It's in Kentucky, as most of you know, and it was frequently flooded. So I basically grew up in a floodplain. Most of my hometown is a floodplain, and it's okay. We don't get earthquakes, so it's not a really overly unsafe place to build on because you all think don't build on loose sediment, but we don't get a lot of earthquakes, so it wasn't that big of a deal. But the problem was flooding, so you always had a basement that could handle flooding. Everybody deals with their own hazards in their own ways, but these areas around floodplains, the reason, I mean, it seems obvious now, but it makes sense to live in a floodplain because back in the early days of civilization, people needed to live near rivers. They were the easiest way to transport. There were sources for fresh water, for food. So yes, it's a floodplain, but it tends to be places where you find cities, especially in your along the Mississippi River, which is a big, giant, old, meandering river.